Hi, and welcome to Mindful, Beautiful, and Thriving, a podcast series by Taarikas Foundation focused on youth mental health. Before we begin today's episode, I just wanted to let you all know that all content that is found in our podcast is created for informational purposes only. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, treatment, or therapy. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition, and never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard in this podcast. Thank you so much, and without further ado, let's get started.
Hi, this is an episode of our series on biculturalism. Here we have me, Vihan, and my co-host Sovin. Today we are interviewing two parents who are both immigrants from two different countries. Hello, Miss and Mr. Giles. Thank you for participating in our podcast. Miss Giles is from Vietnam, and she came to the U.S. at 8 years old in 1975 after the fall of Vietnam. Mr. Giles is from England and immigrated to the U.S. when he was 30 to marry Mrs. Giles. Mr. Giles is an executive at a fintech company and works with a very diverse team, so being familiar with different cultures is important to his success. Miss Giles is an executive consultant and loves playing pinball. She grew up in the Bay Area.
All right, so our first question is going to be, was the transition from your home country to this country overwhelming, or did you guys find certain similar aspects between the two that made the transition easier? Now, for both of you, it's a little different because you both came from different countries.
Okay, so for me, it was a bit more challenging because I didn't speak the language. I didn't even know the word hello, you know what I mean? Literally, I didn't speak the language, and the culture is very new and different. And so it was a long journey to assimilate.
So for me, I had an entirely different experience. I'm from England. I speak English. And I've seen a lot of American movies, so I thought I knew what I was getting into. And I came over here, and I think what was most challenging for me was just the fact that I was doing it when I was 30 years old. So I'd already grew up in an environment and was very familiar with a particular way of life. And I had to change that way of life. And that was partly learning to understand the American culture, learning to understand the Vietnamese culture. It was us living together, me changing jobs, and moving from a very different environment. So I grew up and lived in the country, green fields all around me, to the middle of Silicon Valley. So I did have my challenges, but nothing like Tu Yet went through for sure.
I understand that. It must have been very hard for both of you guys to assimilate into American culture. For Tu Yet, it was the fact that she came so young from a different country and didn't know how to speak the language. And for you, Mr. Giles, it was probably the fact that you came so late in life. It was kind of hard to change the habits that you've been growing up with for so many years.
That's exactly right.
So was it easy or very hard for you guys to assimilate into American culture? And what about your beliefs did you have to change? Or what cultural norms did you have to adapt to?
So for me, I think it was quite a straightforward transition, or so I thought at the time. I think that the last 10 years, certainly the last 4 years for me, have really highlighted to me that whilst I thought I knew what the American culture was like, I realize it's a very narrow view of America. It's not just California, it's very much Silicon Valley. So my view of American culture is very narrowly focused on Silicon Valley. As I work with more people, I begin to understand other aspects of the American culture. And so for me, I still find it something that I continue to learn about every day in the same way that I learn about other people's cultures from other countries. I don't think I necessarily had to adapt any of my beliefs. I happen to be a Christian. I was a Christian in England. We continue that faith here. So I think our fundamental beliefs and the fact that it's a Western culture and move into another Western culture was relatively straightforward to me.
So first of all, you did a great job summarizing what we said earlier, and you're right, it was difficult for me it was kind of double-edged sword. It was difficult, meaning because we were very poor, but at the same time, because I came here when I was 8. And so research shown that when you come here when you're younger, you assimilate easier. And so it was easy for me. And also the fact that I love to talk, it helped even more, right? And so it was easy and hard in that way. The culture is definitely like, for example, when I was growing up, I couldn't go to dances because my parents says going to dance is like having fun and you should be focused on your studies. You shouldn't be having boyfriends, and things like that, or just having fun with friends. No, you had to be heads down and study, which, is good because, I'm successful today because I did that. But that was one example of a belief and a cultural difference. There were many, and I think we don't have enough time for me to share all of them, but I think hopefully that one example was good enough.
I mean, I'm personally Indian, so like I kind of have exposure to like Eastern beliefs, I guess you could say a little bit too. So I was just wondering though, were there any things that, for both you thought that would have been hard but weren't as hard when you came here? Like any things that you found similar?
I think for me, I don't really see any of those transitions as hard or difficult or even that surprising. So as I was growing up, a lot of the TV shows that I was watching would have come from America. And so I felt somewhat familiar with American norms, American just way of life. There are definitely differences in way of life, but they're more, practicalities rather than beliefs or cultural differences. And a hilarious example that tripped me up for many months when I first got here was trying to order a glass of water in a restaurant, and the waitresses or waiters would just stare at me and say, well, what's this guy saying? It took me a while to get to water as opposed to water. And it was interesting coming into an environment where there isn't such a large difference in accents, and so people do have a hard time understanding you. It was the first time in my life I'd actually come across that. It made me think, it's like, well, if I'm experiencing this, I can't imagine what it would be like for anyone from, a radically different culture or speaking a second language, what it must be like for them. But I think in general, because I had an expectation of what America would be like, it didn't feel hard. It was just different and some practicalities that just tripped me up every now and again.
Now, the other flip side of it is you had the question, the similarities between the two of us that made the transition easier. So, it's one thing to say, I grew up in America, my heart, I'm still Vietnamese. And so entering my relationship with Greg and our marriage, there is, a bit of also challenging of Eastern and Western culture in how we are partners and also how we raise our daughter. But to answer the question, because I assimilated into the Western culture, it made a little bit easier. So even though I'm Vietnamese, Greg married someone who has Western values and thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. So you were Vietnamese and adapted to the American culture, which was a large change. I was English adapting to the American culture, which is a small change. So we're able to find similarities because you were aware of the Western culture and you grew up with the Western culture. My exposure to the Eastern culture was very shallow and naive. And so I think as we were going through our first few years, that was a lot of learning for me. It also wasn't surprising. I'd already embraced the fact that I was learning a new culture. So it wasn't as if I was attempting to impose my Western values over the top of it. It was something I wanted to embrace. Although I have to admit, I still can't speak the language. other than food and salutations.
So turning this towards kids. So your teen daughter Madison was born in Silicon Valley, California. So how are you helping her experience the culture and values that both of you grew up with? And then why is it important to us?
So we help Madison experience the culture and values that we grew up, meaning that, even though it was limited for me, only 8 years in Vietnam, the 8 years was enough to be exposed to the culture. And because there's a big population of Vietnamese community in Silicon Valley in the Bay Area, so it was easy for me to say, okay, New Year's is a big event, right? We call it Tet. And so we take her to Vietnam Town on, Tully Road, and we, teach her, like, this is the food that you celebrate, and why do you celebrate New Year's? And, what's the importance of the dragon dance? And why do we make it such a big deal to celebrate Tet? And so things like that, I exposed her since, she's born. We have family gatherings, and I explained to her, like, in New Year's, and then during the fall, we have this thing called Autumn Festival. It's kind of like your Diwali, right? And so we think of it as gathering, getting together, having food, but we expose her to making the lanterns. We actually make the lanterns, and then we do a procession, right? And so she grew up with lots of it, though it's unfortunate that I didn't teach her or didn't speak to her in Vietnamese, but she's very exposed. If you ask her, she'll tell you that she's British Vietnamese more so than American.
Yeah, British Vietnamese American. And so from a British perspective or an English perspective, we don't necessarily celebrate the different national holidays. There's obviously a large overlap because they're two Christian countries, so we've got the same observances, things like Easter and Christmas. Then there's other holidays, and whether that's we have a May Day, which is basically a spring festival. We have another celebration in the autumn. Virtually every culture has an autumn festival of some description. We do talk a lot about, what it would be like in England and how it would be different or the same. In addition to that, though, one of the stark differences, I think, between the two of us, Tuyet and I, is the different way that we think about humor and our different thinking around humor. And so I think for me, when I think about the cultural, not necessarily the values, but the cultural elements, there are other aspects of the British culture. Monty Python is a classic one, where we do celebrate the differences between our culture. And so I think Madison lives in this unique space where she both fully embraces aspects of the Vietnamese lifestyle, the British lifestyle, as well as the American lifestyle, and manages to blend them all together. And so, as Tuyet said, her self-declared cultural identity is British Vietnamese American.
Yeah, the other thing that I think was important is the food. So when you think Vietnamese, you think of pho, right? It's like when I think of Indian, I think of curries, right? Wonderful. Now that we're exposed to it, dosas, right? But you think of the food first. And so Madison is exposed to all the Vietnamese foods. It's great that she loves them. And so I get to enjoy them, but otherwise I've heard of other biracial families where, the Western partner and the kids don't like some of the Vietnamese foods because some of it involves this stinky sauce called fish sauce, and they're like, ew, but she loves it. And then so she thinks of it like pho. And then on the British side, we have the shepherd's pie and mince pies. And so when visually, or when she thinks about food, she thinks of, she is like pho, where pho meets mince pies. And so that's another way that we help her experience the culture. And with respect to the values, as I alluded to earlier, Vietnamese culture is very much about respect and obedience. And so we instill that in her. Whether she's speaking to, like, for example, she would say Dr. Lena. She wouldn't say, Miss Lena or Lena. In the Western culture, if your uncle, you just call him, hey, Sam, right? And we say to Madison, no, if he's your uncle or he's an elder, you say Uncle Sam. You don't just say Sam. So that's an example, a very simple example of the Asian culture.
I see. That's really interesting because finding ways to kind of incorporate your home culture into a place where the culture is so vibrant and so like out there is kind of hard. So to see that you guys have found success in doing it is really impressive. But my next question is, what advice would you give to other multicultural families about cultural disagreements, such as different ideas, views, thoughts, and beliefs that cause friction, and how did you deal with them?
Okay, so I think I have a good example. The good thing about our relationship is we're very open from the start. And so if we do have disagreements, the first thing we do is we talk about them. We don't just go the silent treatment type of thing or play the mind games. We don't do that in our family. We share that and we say, well, I am not happy right now for the following reasons, or I'm sad because. And so we talk about them. But do we come to an agreement? No, but it may be days. And so we deal with it that way. But first and foremost, we openly talk about that. And that in itself is a cultural difference, because in the Western culture is very open and we talk openly. But if I didn't embrace the Western culture, I would be quiet. I would just internalize my feelings like my sister does. She's older than me. And so she's still not assimilated. And so when she does have disagreements, she will internalize and keep quiet. And that in itself can be explosive later on, right? But within our family, I think we openly talk about it. Wouldn't you say so, Greg?
Yes, I think so. And I think to make it tangible, we don't deal with a lot of disagreements between our cultures. There are considerable differences, but we both come from a place of embracing each other's culture and respecting the fact that there are differences. I think one area, though, that is tangible, that Tuya mentioned earlier, is this notion of fun. So within an English culture, I believe, somewhat American as well, it's important for kids to be kids. It's important to have a balance of focus on education, as well as some aspect of having fun. Because the aspect of having fun, it isn't just, oh, you're going to be happy at the end of it, you're enjoying yourself. It by itself is a different sort of learning experience. The learning experience that you will get from fun activities may be interacting with your friends, understanding how to build those social interactions, understanding how to deal with personal disagreements. Or, as a boy growing up, a lot of those activities would be hands-on. We would be either running, playing, swimming, going in the streams, all by ourselves without our parents. They're all learning activities, but they're not education-based or academic-based activities. And I know, some points that we've had discussions around certainly have been about that, trying to get a balance both feel is reasonable and acceptable, and marrying that into the Silicon Valley life, because the Silicon Valley life certainly is very different, presents very, very different pressures for children in this environment.
And if I can add to this, we actually do not have a lot of disagreements. Mm-hmm. But when we do have cultural disagreement, it's always around parenting. Mm-hmm. it's around parenting. And I cannot overemphasize that.
Yeah.
But otherwise, we're very too amicable people. And sometimes people even say, ew, we're too lovey-dovey. But when it comes to parenting, and in Silicon Valley, yep, definitely cultural differences.
So flowing into the next question, does your daughter question you or sometimes not want to follow your culture or belief system?
Yeah, so I think I'll expand on this question a little bit to include sort of cultural and belief differences. And I'll take a more liberal definition of belief, so it's not just religion aspects of it. I think fundamentally, Madison has been embracing of our cultures because she's been immersed in them since day one. So if you immerse somebody in something, you don't really know any different. And you're correct to observe that, as she gets more exposed to school and she goes through teenage years and her friends have more influence, there is an opportunity then for that to be biased more towards the American culture. I personally believe that she's still very embracing of those. She enjoys all aspects of our culture. That doesn't mean that we don't have, differences in, what we expect of her and what she does. So I think that certainly within Silicon Valley, and is prevalent across many aspects of the, different developed countries, are things around social interactions, our emphasis on the digital environments, such as the one we're actually being part of here. And I think, our fundamental belief, and it is a belief, so not a religious belief, is that these are actually very negative experiences in the early development years. I think as adults even, we sometimes struggle to deal with them effectively. I think they're particularly problematic as somebody is developing and growing up. And I see a lot of value in personal relationships, personal interactions. And so this extends into multiple areas, even to things like, so what about a phone? Is it appropriate to have a smartphone, or is a flip phone good enough? So I think there's a lot of areas like that where beliefs are different. I can't think of too many cultural differences or challenges that we've had with Madison.
Yeah, no, I don't think so at all. I think that Madison embraced both our culture and the American culture. I think it more has to do with teens. I think it's more about the development of it, of the stages that you guys are in, right? The teens years where you want to gain your independence. It's not so much, oh my God, my mom is Vietnamese, I'm so embarrassed. She's doing Vietnamese things, or we're celebrating Vietnamese New Year, we're doing this, or we're eating Vietnamese food. No, as a matter of fact, she embraces it and she is proud of that. But where the difference is, where she questioned us is more around, like I said, it's teen years. It's not cultural.
So that makes sense, because I think the questioning is a teen thing, but as you said, you've raised your daughter very well to embrace that culture and not be ashamed of it. So leading into our next question, have there ever been situations where you guys do get into a conflict with your daughter over cultural situations? And what did you do in those situations to, de-escalate and keep everything calm?
So yes, there is an example in the Vietnamese culture. We rarely say "I love you" unless we truly mean it. I'm like, everybody goes, "I love you," and "I love you, I love you," and I'm like, no, I don't. But Madison likes to hear that, and so we get into this conflict where she feels that I don't love her because I don't say it, right? Or it gets from that to an escalation where we would be arguing over silly things. And so one of the things that we do to de-escalate, and I know it sounds funny, but we all do a timeout, right? And so what I would say personally is I'd say, I'm going to step away from this conversation. I love you, but we all need to go to our rooms. And so that worked, and that took me a while before I was just responding, reacting. And as I went to like parenting classes, they say the best form of de-escalation is actually to take ourselves out of the situation. And when I say ourselves, parent, out of the situation, because really you can't really send a teen to a room, because I think they like going to their rooms. And so I go to my room, and it worked for us. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. That was a really good answer to the question, because it was a very complicated question, because, conflicts are hard to figure out, and sometimes, they can get out of hand. So having a good and reliable way to keep them stable is good.
So now I'm going to ask you, what's your message to all the parents listening to this podcast?
So when I think about the parent point of view, obviously I was a parent, and I can remember when Madison was born in those first few years. And I think that, we as parents have got our own set of pressures. Like Tuyet said, we don't have a manual. We're figuring out as we go. We do talk to other parents a lot. Some of those parents happen to come from similar cultures, some from diverse cultures. We are lucky within our family that we've got a wide network of friends with a lot of very, very diverse backgrounds, including a whole set of different Eastern cultures as well as different Western cultures. And we try to sample all of them. What I would say to any parent, and I have seen parents struggle, and we have helped different parents talk through their struggles, is that it is important to impart upon our children the cultural values and beliefs that we grew up with. We have an identity, and that identity is important. It's also important, though, to have some understanding of the American culture and beliefs. We all came here for different reasons, but we obviously thought that this was a good place to be. And what constitutes, the values and beliefs of a country? It's the people within them, and that's embodied by their culture. So there must be some aspects of the culture which are good, and they may be different. It's important to understand them, and then understand how to blend those with your cultures and beliefs that you grew up with. We have seen situations where parents will be a little overbearing and tend to impose their beliefs and culture they grew up with, yet be very detached from the American way of doing things. And it's not that the American way of doing things is necessarily better, but we're all living in the same place. And so coming to a common understanding, a common set of beliefs, some middle ground for a lot of these aspects is challenging, but very important. And it's up to us as parents to navigate that, not leave it to our kids to figure it out, and help them bring through them bring them through that journey.
So I'll piggyback on what Greg said. I think as much as we say, my advice to the teens is to ask, also the parents is to have your, that network, and also to ask. But at the same time, the students are, they're in Silicon Valley, they live in America. And so meet them where they're at, which is here, right? And for teens, it's talk less, hugs more hugs, sorry, show support. And that's always hard, because we want to, instill our values, what was taught in our homeland, what was taught by our culture. But again, they're here, you guys are here. And so we have to meet where you guys are, right? And we all have bad hair days, right? And so be empathetic. And I say that, but it's still very hard for me. But I'm learning, right? And so for me, when it comes to safety, I'm very firm. Everything else, I have to pick my battles. For example, if she wants to put on makeup, okay, fine. Help her get the makeup she wants and one less battle, right? But I understand it's easier said than done. But what I've learned is the more I practice, the easier it gets to alleviating and de-escalating those conflicts or disagreements.
Yeah, that's actually a really good piece of advice. If you kind of lighten up and see where your children are coming from, it'll avoid unnecessary conflicts. So, in this episode of Mindful, Beautiful, and Thriving, we interviewed two parents who are both immigrants from two different countries, and we learned more about biculturalism. Thank you for listening to our podcast. This is the Taarikas Foundation, and you are listening to Mindful, Beautiful, and Thriving. Be sure to stay safe and stay home.
You are listening to Mindful, Beautiful, and Thriving, a podcast series by Taarikas Foundation. As part of our youth series, we will be releasing new episodes every Friday, so make sure to continue to check those out. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and thank you so much for listening.